I was very fortunate to go to Australia, and the reason I went was because in 2011 increasing the number of health visitors was billed as the only area of growth in government at the time when everybody was being asked to cut back services. And they were deciding to invest in health visitors because of the need to focus on the early years and to improve outcomes for children from age 5, well, throughout their life, and also improve all those things that George and Robin have talked about. So because they were going to increase the number of health visitors, it meant that they were expecting that health visitors were going to work in different ways, in a more proactive way in terms of early intervention and prevention. So I was involved in 2011 in running a series of training workshops for all the 200 health visitors in Essex. And at the same time, the health visitor implementation lead for Essex was negotiating with the commissioners regarding what evidence-based models they were going to use to enhance health visiting practice. So I expect many of you have heard of the Family Nurse Partnership, which is an evidence-based intervention that's particularly focusing on providing sustained home visiting for teenage mothers. So they're not necessarily health visitors, but the equivalent of a health visitor makes contact with the teenage mother from as early as possible during pregnancy and then carries on visiting them until the baby's 2. So they're offered intensive home visiting, particularly to focus on all the challenges that they face, but also nurturing the parent-infant relationship. So in Essex, many of the health visitors were saying that they were concerned that the Family Nurse Partnership, although it was useful for teenage mothers, that there were a lot of mothers who were not teenagers who were still very vulnerable and living in complex and challenging circumstances. And they felt that those mothers also needed some kind of intensive intervention. And part of the new health visiting model that was talked about in the National Health Visitor Implementation Plan, a call to action, said that we were going to have 4 levels of health visiting practice. So we're going to have building community capacity, which I know some people here are going to do their projects around. We're going to have a universal service, which everybody gets, a universal plus service, which is for those families who have temporary issues which they need a bit of extra support with, and then universal partnership plus, which is for those very vulnerable families who might need more help. So the commissioners looked at some of the evidence-based programmes from around the world, and they decided that they would commission the health visitors in Essex to be trained in the MESH programme. And the MESH stands for Maternal Early Childhood Sustained Home Visiting. And this was particularly a programme that is involve mothers from as early as possible during pregnancy, and you carry on visiting them until the baby's 2, and they have around about 25 visits during that time. And so there was a commitment to take on MESH in Essex, and because I was involved in delivering the workshops for the health visitors, it was decided that at every workshop we'd introduce some information about MESH. And because of that, I had to meet the originator of MESH, so that's Professor Lynn Kemp from the Centre for Health Equity Training, Research and Evaluation from the University of New South Wales. So she came over several times, talked about MESH, and said that there were 2 things that underpinned MESH, 2 essential models. One was called the Family Partnership Model, which some of you may be familiar with, but it's a way of working with families. And the second model was called Learning to Communicate. So I was already trained in how to deliver the Family Partnership Model, which is not the same as the Nurse Family Partnership. But because this again is an Australian programme, nobody really knew about Learning to Communicate. So I felt somebody needed to go to Australia and meet the person who invented the programme find out more about it, find out how it was being used in Australia, talk to the equivalent of health visitors in Australia about how they were delivering MESH and delivering learning to communicate within MESH, so that then I could bring it back and tell the health visitors in Essex who I was already working with. So Learning to Communicate was developed by a speech and language therapist, and is therefore sort of really based on developing communication skills, but it's actually much more than that. It's about actually fostering that early relationship, encouraging parents to tune into their baby's cues, and it also provides a framework for thinking about early childhood development. So it's a kind of, what will you expect your baby to be doing at certain ages? Have you noticed this? Have you noticed that? And it comes with a DVD. So the way it's supposed to be delivered is that one visit every month during the programme of visits that the health visitor is offering to the families who've been enrolled in the programme, one visit every month is focusing on child development. So every parent is given the book and the DVD when they're enrolled in the programme, and then one visit a month. If they haven't looked at the DVD or the book, it doesn't matter, because the health visitor will say, would it be helpful for us to watch the DVD together and think about, babies of the same age as your baby, what they're doing, what they like doing? And it's really just a springboard to think about how the baby's developing and what their baby's doing, what they can think about is happening next, what they can do to foster development, how they can communicate with their babies, what they need to do to keep the babies safe. So it's all the things that health visitors would normally do. So I went to, so obviously I'd met Lynn Kemp, and she was wonderful in setting me up with all sorts of opportunities when I got to Sydney. But one problem when I got there, and I said, okay, right, I'd like to go out with some child and family health nurses, they're the equivalent of health visitors, and talk about MESH, talk about learning to communicate. And the first team that I met were actually the team that were involved in the research for MESH, the randomised controlled trial that was done originally. So I met the research nurse, who is now a nurse consultant in delivering the programme. And I said, I'm very interested to come out with one of your nurses and talk to you about learning to communicate. So we're not using that anymore. So I went back to Professor Kemp and said, they said they're not using it anymore. And she said, no, because after we did the research programme, some of the service managers decided that they'd like to look at other models of, they're called parent education child development programmes. And so in this particular area in Sydney, they've decided not to use this programme as their way of talking to parents about how they can tune into their baby's development and foster communication. So what they were using was a Canadian model called Nurturing Parent-Infant Relationships. So I don't know if anybody's heard of that one. So I said, is there anywhere else I can go and see where they're using learning to communicate? Bearing in mind that back in Essex, everybody has signed up to using learning to communicate, is using learning to communicate. So Lynn Kemp said, actually, nobody's using it in Australia. So at that moment I thought, oh dear, I'm a bit of a fraud now. I've got all this way to learn about learning to communicate, and the communication's broken down and they're not really actually using it. But I was introduced to Teresa Anderson, who was the author of this programme, and in their defence they did say that they were reviewing it and revising it and improving it in collaboration with groups of parents and speech and language therapists. So it has been revised and improved, and this is the revised, improved, updated version. And I did go around and meet lots of child and family health nurses and found that they were using a variety of models, but the kind of essence of what they were doing was the same. So in Adelaide, I spent a week in Adelaide, they were using something called the Wonder Weeks, which I don't know if anybody's familiar with, and that's a Dutch version of a parent education child development programme. And in the area where they were particularly focusing on working with Aboriginal families who were living in urban environments, they were using a program called Parents as Teachers, which I know is also used in some parts of this country. So whilst I was there, they did have a workshop on learning to communicate, because they were hoping to, sort of roll it out in some other places. And they were certainly going to carry on using it as the framework for teaching parents, working with parents on communication and development in the extra places where they were going to roll out MESH. So in other parts of the world where MESH is now being introduced, this is still the sort of underlying program that they're using. So although I didn't actually necessarily talk to people specifically about learning to communicate, I did have the privilege of going out with several teams, several child and family health nurses, and seeing how they were using the MESH program and what program they were using instead of learning to communicate. And as I said, I did talk to the author, and I did talk about the principles and what they thought was the importance in applying this model in practice. So we did talk about how we were going to use it in Essex. Since I've come back, they have carried on using MESH. They're in their third year of using MESH and learning to communicate in Essex. They're also now, MESH has been used as the model for the Universal Partnership Plus bit of health visiting in Plymouth and Somerset and Jersey, and Lewisham are about to do MESH and learning to communicate. And I am part of the MESH UK community of practice, which has been set up to facilitate a dialogue between all the different sites in the UK, and also to provide a bridge between what's going on in the UK and what's going on in Australia. And really, also as a sort of side effect of talking to lots of child and family health nurses in Australia and doing the work that I did with health visitors, I was really kind of stimulated to think about some of the challenges that are facing health visitors and child and family health nurses. So it's kind of an indirect consequence of doing the fellowship. I got together with somebody else, and we thought about what we could do to help health visitors in this kind of period when they've got lots and lots of student health visitors coming on board, and they've often got far more students than they normally have. So we've set up a company and developed a range of training resources particularly for health visitors. And because I've sort of just been really thinking a lot in Australia and in this country about that early nurturing environment and the kind of what gets in the way of mothers, perhaps that relationship. And because I did originally have a role as a nurse consultant in perinatal and infant mental health, I've decided I really need to kind of target my thinking around mothers with mental health problems and how that impacts on their relationships with babies. So I've recently started a full-time PhD. So that's what I'm looking at. So that's what I've done since coming back. Oh, I'm sorry, I just forgot to say that here's one I made earlier. I thought the new fellows might want to look at a report. They take many forms, and mine's got lots of pictures and it's more of a narrative, but I just thought if you want to have a look at my completed report. And whilst I was in Australia, I was asked to be a keynote speaker at a conference that's called MESH Goes Global, which was very scary actually. But if anybody wants to see the report or to look at the Learning to Communicate booklets, they're very welcome.